technical problems. Today is the discussion will be, or will try to be, on President George W. Bush, often known as Jr. He was the 43rd president of the United States, and he was the son of wealthy parents and grandparents. He had all the accoutrements of great wealth, and he was a native Texan, as opposed to his family, which came down from Connecticut. They all shared the same connections: the summer home in Kennebunkport with its 27 or so bedrooms. And they shared an interest in oil in Texas. And in all these many ways, the man who became George W. Bush still failed in his presidency. There were early signals of this failure to come. First, they occurred in Texas. He wanted to own a football team, so he got hold of the Texas Rangers. In the process of borrowing against and then selling, the process drew the attention of the Securities and Exchange Commission for insider trading. This left a bad smell around the ways that this man conducted business. To be perfectly honest, he had what they call in polite society a drinking problem. Now, this is not to be accusatory. Alcoholism is a disease, and many people are able to work their way around it. Bush said he worked his problem out, particularly after he met Reverend Billy Graham, who was a very important religious figure in the America of that day. But other things continued to haunt him. His DUI that he got in Maine could not be erased. So he had this arrest record. But more important, in trying to overlook some of these early foibles in his career, you have the most calamitous election in the history of American elections. For some reason, Florida, which we would have probably been better off if we had left with Spain, can never hold an election in which there are not problems. And there were mighty problems with the election that year between former Vice President Al Gore and George Bush. And then stepping into this quandary because they could not get the count straight, the Supreme Court of the United States stopped the count. Unfortunately, as seen by the Al Gore people, they stopped it at a point where Bush was ahead. So Bush becomes President of the United States in a most contested election. But it was to be. Al Gore stepped back for what he called the good of the nation. Bush went forward and Bush stayed while Al Gore retreated to do his wonderful work on the environment. While in the White House, Bush was ill-served by his cabinet. First, for Secretary of Defense, he had Donald Rumsfeld. And as Vice President, he had Dick Cheney, something he could not change. But later in his 4 years, he does finally ask Cheney to ask Rumsfeld for his resignation. You can't ask the Vice President. You can, but you can't force him to resign. In that duo, there was a trio, another troublesome person. Her name was Condoleezza Rice. Very nice person. She had come to my attention when I was at Berkeley serving as a vice chairman and needing somebody to be a graduation speaker. I called Stanford and asked them if they had on their faculty a visiting person, basically an affirmative action hire. For we had one. He was called a Chancellor's Fellow. He had upset our department. His field was Chicano gangs in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And Stanford had one. They weren't called chancellors, they were president's fellows. And her name was Condoleezza Rice. I invited Conde to come and give a graduation talk. I told him there would be over 1,000 people in the Greek theater, and it would be a good chance for her to shine. She came, much to the unhappiness of part of the faculty who didn't know who she was or what she was, and were in fact unhappy about inviting someone just because they were a woman or just because they were African American. But she came, we had lunch, we went backstage and robed, and then we went out and she gave a very nice talk. And the students and the students' parents seemed to enjoy it. So I marked it up as a success. Now, while Conde was serving in this position, she'd moved on to help the president of Stanford because he had just come on the block and he was having lots of troubles with affirmative action on campus. It seems that former President Kennedy of Stanford had a very ambitious wife who had used basically US Navy research money on campus to redecorate the president's house. The Navy looks badly on people who use their money for other than Navy research. And in the brouhaha that resulted, Stanford's leadership asked President Kennedy to step down, he and his wife. And they did. So there was now a new president who just come in from Chicago, where he had had lots of fights with the president of the University of Chicago. Her name was Hannah. Now he gets to Stanford and discovers things are even worse in Palo Alto than they are in Chicago over the demands of minorities, women, to get positions on the faculty or to get in. And so it is that the new man reaches down and picks up Conde and makes her then the second most important person on campus so that people can see that in the front office there is an African American woman. This is one of the tragedies of affirming actions that are not reasonable. You don't choose somebody because of their race or their sex. You choose them because they're good. And if you choose them for the other reason and then they fail, you set them up for a permanent kind of failure because then the people who didn't want them to begin with can say, well, look, we tried it and it just didn't work. A long and hard and difficult story. Nevertheless, there was someone on the Stanford campus in a very strange building. It's called the Hoover Towers. The Hoover, which is set up as a research center for war, revolution, and peace, they say, is what we at Berkeley used to call like a place in Africa where old, ancient elephants go to die. This was most unkind and most unfair, but nevertheless, it's how we looked at it. And one of those elephants was named George Shultz, who was serving since his years in the Nixon administration, where he'd been a whiz kid at the budget. He's now in the Hoover as a fellow. And he saw Conde's work, and he recommended her to the Bush search team in Texas who were looking for the administration that would come to power. And Bush very much liked her and brought her, therefore, into the cabinet in a very highly specialized area. But it was Rumsfeld and Cheney and Condoleezza who did not serve the president well. The basic problem here is that Bush was not a very smart guy. He had gone to Yale. He was what you'd call a person who can buy his way in because he's a legacy. And while there, he had basically been a very poor student. He used to pride himself on his C-level work. He was also a cheerleader for their very poor football team. And he also had a penchant to join odd clubs, to include Skull and Bones, which his father had belonged to also at Yale. Skull and Bones has a very unusual passage of rights to joining. The senior members of Skull and Bones are upstairs on a balcony, and you come in to the lower floor, and then the senior males urinate on you. This is the oddest rite of passage I've ever heard of, but it seems to be fondly remembered as a initiation into Skull and Bones at Yale. All of this portended not good. The sale of that football team in Texas, which smelled of a problem of insider trading, the drinking, which resulted in a DUI up in Maine, and now a cabinet full of people who would not serve the president well. Now, there is nothing wrong with being, shall we say, not smart. If everyone in this country who wasn't smart was fired or let go, we'd have a national tragedy. The problem is you don't make someone who isn't up to the job the president of the United States. And we did. Almost immediately, problems arose. Some of the good things, few as they are, that went on was that there was an opening on the Supreme Court. Sandra Day O'Connor was stepping down. Bush thought it was a good thing to put a woman on the court. He tried, she couldn't get through. So he sent somebody else forward. That somebody else is the current head of the Supreme Court. It turns out to be a very excellent nomination, and it succeeded in getting approval. That and an Italian American were his two Supreme Court nominees that made it through the selection process. The real problem is you should never trust who you send up to the court. They get the job for life. That means they might end up not agreeing with you or the follow-on presidents. Someone who should have learned that a long time ago was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He had such trouble with the court. But at last an opening came and he could put his great friend and the man he admired much at the Harvard Law School, Felix Frankfurter, onto the court. And so he did. And the first thing he found out was that Frankfurter did not agree with much of what was New Deal legislation and kept voting for it to be found unconstitutional. So it is with these court appointees. But Bush got two through. He worked hard at making this work for his administration, but he was bound to soon tumble into international politics in a bad way. He felt on a personal level that the man who ran the country we call Iraq, Saddam Hussein, who was in fact a terrible person by any measure, had plotted to kill his father, the senior Bush, and he wanted revenge. This is not a good reason to lead your country to war. And as it was, Senior Bush escaped any attention of a gunman to kill him. Nevertheless, in Rumsfeld at Defense and Cheney right there in the White House, gunning for war, we were going to go to war. All of this is going to lead us to worse and worse adventures. But c'est la guerre. And so it was that war came to Iraq, us attacking them. We used a phony excuse that they were trying to collect the ingredients for nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, and other terror weapons. We said we had proof that there was somehow a certain amount of yellow uranium-grade ore that had been taken from Gabon in Africa to Iraq. And as Paris told us over and over again, the uranium that is mined in Gabon is mined by French engineers. The mine is owned by French engineering companies. All of the yellow cake uranium is shipped from Gabon to France. And in fact, if anyone overthrows the government in Gabon, in 24 hours, the French Foreign Legion shows up. They're still around. And they reestablish the old order because France is heavily dependent on this uranium in order to run their nuclear power plants. So there was none that had escaped the French, and they're very good at knowing what they have and where it is and where it's going and who is shipping it and when it's arriving. But the Bush team insisted that Saddam Hussein had it. It's a major, major problem because he didn't have it. And then we move into an ugly chapter, even uglier than the ones that preceded. There was a woman, Valerie Plame, and she had been a CIA agent and an undercover agent at that. And nevertheless, the White House outed her in public because she had written an article that said that this had not happened, this yellow cake uranium snatch by Saddam. So she and her husband went under the X-ray machine of the press, and in the process, it came out that she was right. The one who had dropped the dime on her was named Scooter Libby. He worked directly for the Vice President of the United States. In the final results of the investigation, Libby was found guilty of violating various laws of the United States of America involving the release of classified information. And he went to jail. And for the rest of Cheney's time in the White House, he kept begging Bush to pardon. And if you pay attention to the news today, you know that any number of people are getting pardoned. It's just like pardoning. Parties are being held. Just show me a crook and I'll pardon them. But George didn't do that. He didn't pardon Ludia, which angered the vice president. And so the argument went on. Now, it's not, as I say, George's fault that he isn't very smart, but he isn't. When he got ready to pick the man, this is after we've invaded Iraq, foolishly doing so, not following his father's advice, where his father had stopped the first attack. That was the attack that led to the expulsion of the Iraqi forces from Kuwait, and then stopping. We had not stopped. We had gone in recklessly. We destroyed some of the world's greatest antiquities. The museum in Baghdad was absolutely criminal, what we did. And to run the place, you won't believe this, George found a State Department diplomat that he liked, not because he had any special knowledge of the Middle East or of Iraq in particular, but because when he interviewed this guy wore cowboy boots. And Bush commented on that. He liked those cowboy boots. He thought this was a sign of a very smart man. Well, it wasn't. Maybe the dumbest man for his time in that area of the world, working for America. So what does he do? He arrives in Baghdad as our vice consul. And he makes the decision that the problem is, and this is a decision that is also backed by Rumsfeld and Cheney, that it's not just Saddam Hussein who's a bad guy, but it's people who are in control.
Yes.
This is the Ba'athist
Good.
Sunni
Right.
elite.
Right.
So he fires them all down to the lowest. So we have co-opted an elite. We decapitated the possibility of any leadership for Iraq, and we've put in their place stooges. Well, the elite did not accept this final verdict. And so we have now Iraq, which has never before been a country. It was created at the end of World War I, artificially out of a couple of provinces that had belonged to the Ottoman Empire when the Ottoman Turks ran this world we were now engulfed in. So we have a man in Baghdad who wears cowboy boots, a man who has decapitated the likely leadership that would help us run the country, and everything goes to hell in a handbasket. And no one's surprised, or are they? It's hard to believe things could just get so bad so quickly. Now, I promised you two stories. One set in Cairo today, one set in Baghdad almost 1,500 years ago. Which to do first? Why don't we do Cairo? Unlike the photographs you see in your mind when Cairo, the plateau across the Nile River on the Giza Plateau with its wonderful Sphinx and its 3 marvelous pyramids, there's another Cairo. There's a very middle class, upper middle class, loaded down with Cairenes who have good educations, have traveled to speak both English, French, and some German. They live out near the big Turkish-built airport near Heliopolis. It's not the only place they live. They can be seen later dancing in the old Shepherd's Hotel, which was the British watering hole in the days when the British and the French were the big powers in Egypt. So now the question is what to do with this Cairo elite. Well, there was a doctor who lived in Heliopolis, and he had a very smart son, Mohammed Atta. Mohammed got a good education. Mohammed drove a fast car around Cairo. The German government, to help the Egyptian government, had offered a large number of scholarships to good German universities. And this Mohammed Atta had scored well on the exams and was admitted to a special kind of German university, a technical Hochschule. And this particular one was the Technical Hochschule Hamburg. And so Mohammed Atta went to Hamburg, studied, wrote an excellent thesis according to his advisor. Here's the first hint. His thesis was about how the West had come to the greater Arab world and ruined many of these magnificent Arab cities. Take, he says, Damascus as an example. What had ruined the city was that its cityscape, once typically Arabic, was now loaded down with a lot of tall buildings that needed to be destroyed so that one could return to the essence of being a great Arab center of civilization. Destroying tall buildings, a good hint. Mohammed Atta was one of the number of people who flew a number of airplanes. First coming to the United States and signing up for training. Another hint. They didn't worry about taking off and they didn't worry about landing. They just wanted to know how to fly the airplane and turn it this way and that way. Do you think that's a little odd? That they don't care to get up or to get down? They just want to be in the air. And they were trained by us. And Mohammed Atta was the pilot of one of the United Airlines that flew into the World Towers building and ended up bringing it down. There are incidents like that that one usually remembers one's entire life. I remember where I was the day Kennedy was shot. I remember where I was the day that Martin Luther King was shot. And I certainly remember where I was when Mohammed Atta flew into that building. I was in Rome with 3 friends. I got a phone call that morning in Rome. There's a good friend he was a journalist, worked for the Corriere della Sera, the big daily newspaper in Milan. He was their Rome correspondent. He didn't say much. He just called my name and said, "Go to your TV set." So I went and I turned the TV on, and there on all stations was a airplane that had obviously crashed into the side of the World Trade Center. And as I watched, the whole center disintegrated. Most of the TV news refused to show the pictures of the people jumping out the windows to avoid the fire, jumping to their death. The president at that time wasn't in Rome with me, but he was down, I believe it was in Florida, but he was talking to some grade school children. They rapidly got him out of there, put him into hiding, for there were other planes. One of them reached the Pentagon and slammed into the side of the Pentagon. One was aimed and supposed to go and ram itself into the White House. The courageous passengers on that flight gave their lives to avoid that not happening, and they went down with the plane before it reached the White House. I go to New York a lot. I like New York. When there, I must always take a group of people with me. We call it the University of California, Berkeley Alumni New York Theater Trip. And every year after that, I would always take them down to the 9/11 site. It's quite well done. The footprint has been smoothed off, and the hollowed center are two reflecting pools. There is also a wall that tries to have all the names of all the people who died. The church nearby where some survivors went, you know, there were people on the street at that time. There were people getting to the building at that time. There was a major subway that opened at that time. So you can do that yourself. You can go and look at 9/11. Leaves a very strong impression. And then what to do, and what brought about such tumultuous joy in many parts of the Arab world. Big celebrations. The Bush family had rapidly seen to it that one of Saddam Hussein's relatives who worked for them in Texas in oil was rapidly flown out of the country. So to try and discover why we were so hated, that people would, in faraway places, celebrate this destructive blow against us, you have to go way, way back. And I'll take you back. I want to go to the year 800 AD. In the year 800 AD, a great caliphate had established itself in Baghdad, because before 800, in the 7th century, a great release of energy had occurred on the Arabian Peninsula, and very large and very fast-moving Arab armies had left Arabia and stormed into the Mediterranean basin. The first caliph was an Umayyad, and his city was Damascus. These Arab armies spread in all directions. They crossed North Africa like a lightning storm. They came to two pillars that the Greeks called pillars of Hercules, and the Arabs had a name for them, Gibraltar. And there was its opposite, and they crossed at that narrow strait and went into and conquered all of southern and Mediterranean Spain. And they kept moving. They followed the Mediterranean up, went through the Pyrenees passes, and introduced themselves to France. They got to the center of France, to Tours, where their army was finally beaten by Charles Martel and forced back across the Pyrenees into Spain, where they stayed in an Arab Spain for 700 years, concentrated mainly in the south, in the land of the setting sun, Andalusia, Andalus, Cordoba, Sevilla, Granada. And as they stayed there, they did what they had done everywhere they went. The Arab world was like a huge sponge. It soaked up everything good it could find in other people and other things. It soaked up all of Greek and Latin learning, all the great works of Aristotle and Plato, Euripides, all of them, the histories of Tacitus, all translated into Greek. In their day, when Cordoba was a great city in Arab Spain, they had a library of 50,000 volumes when there were no libraries in the West at all. Because something had gone wrong in the West. A great decline had set in. When you take your freshman history course, it's often called the Dark Ages. When Rome was at its peak, the greatness that was Greece, the grandeur that was Rome. Rome had a population of over 1 million people. At its decline, it had only 60,000, from 1 million down to 60,000. What had happened? Well, things had fallen apart. The great grain ships that used to sail from ancient Egypt and from North Africa, bringing grain every day to the Roman port city of Ostia, where you could feed the Roman mob. And the great aqueducts that came out of the mountains, the Pyrenees, brought fresh water to all those fountains and all that drinking possibilities. They forgot how to build them. The aqueducts fell apart. The grain ships no longer sailed. Darkness came. You might know that from a very famous English writer's work, The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire. So when you get to the year 800, there's nothing left in the West, nothing worth anything. The Germanic invasions have taken place. The Franks have come into northern France. The Lombards have come into northern Italy. The Goths and Visigoths have come into Spain. The Vandals have come to North Africa. It's all in disarray and decay. And yet, there is a man living in Baghdad at the height of Arab power, because after the Umayyads had faded in their caliphate in Damascus, a new caliphate had risen in Baghdad, the Abbasids, and the head of the Abbasid caliphate was waiting. He got word that there was somebody way off on the fringe of his empire who was going to travel from a river, the Rhineland, in a town, Aachen in German, Aachen-la-Chapelle in French, and he was traveling all the way down through the mountains of the Alps to Rome to be crowned Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope. This man's name was Charlemagne. So the Caliph in Baghdad decided to send him a gift. And he sent a gold and jeweled encrusted clock to this faraway prince. And when the clock arrived in Rome as a gift, no one in Charlemagne's entourage knew how to make it work. neither Charlemagne nor his senior knights could read nor write. They were illiterate. They did have with them, by sheer good chance, some monks who came from the great abbeys, and they could read and write. But as far as Charlemagne was concerned, he knew it was daytime when the sun was up. He knew it was nighttime when the sun was down. He knew it was summer when the days were long. He knew it was winter when the days were short. This is a kind of rudimentary knowledge of the Western world in the year 800, where in opposition to that, you have astronomy in Baghdad. You have incredible knowledge. Did you ever think what it would be like to balance your textbooks in Roman numerals? No, you use Arabic numerals, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. These are gifts from the Arab world. Science, all that we know in the West, will come back to us through the Arab world. And lots of people in the Arab world know that. They knew that they were once on top, and now they weren't on top anymore. And they were bitter, and they felt they had been badly treated by the West. And in the Bush years, the West meant the United States of America. For this war that we had brought to Iraq and to Baghdad, and the destruction of the treasures that were in Baghdad at the time in their museum, our allies wouldn't join us. Finally, of course, always willing to be by our side, depending heavily on the idea of an Anglo-American worldview and a friendship that went deep, which it didn't. Tony Blair decided to sign up for this war. The French decided no. That infuriated the Bush people. It infuriated the Congress. Congress decided that they would no longer call French fries French fries. They would call them American fries. You remember how big that went over. Tony, who was the hope of a new politics in Britain, who had given the country hope again. He had led them through the very terrible times of the death of the People's Princess, Diana Spencer, Princess of Wales. She had shocked the world by letting the world know that she wasn't going to live in a crowded marriage, that the woman known as Camilla, or to some who hated her, Calmilla, was in fact crowding her marriage, and she was getting out. She was going to divorce the heir to the British throne, Charles, the guy with the big ears. They had children. It was messy. And Diana began to see a man who one day would inherit the largest department store in London, Harrods. Dodi Fayed, who was a Muslim, an Arab. His family always believed it was that feature that led to her demise. They had been that morning in Sardinia together on Dodi's yacht. They'd then flown from Sardinia to Paris Wherever she went, she was the constant target of the paparazzi. They wanted always her picture, her photo. These people had driven Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy Onassis crazy. It's the treatment they gave to people who were film stars, stage stars, opera stars. And they gave it to Diana. And so that night, that fateful night in Paris, they had flown up to Paris, trying to escape the paparazzi. Her car, and Dodi was in it with her, driving along the banks of the Seine in that motorway that's been unfortunately built along the river's edge, crashed into the side pillars, and the princess and Dodi were dead. This brought the British monarchy to its worst of days. For some reason, the Queen herself didn't know what to do, and she was up in Scotland, and she wasn't returning. Her own sister, who was a very negative person for most of her life, Margaret, remarked loudly so that she could be heard, quote, "Diana is more trouble dead than she was alive," end quote. The outpouring in London for Diana Spencer was enormous. And it was up to Tony Blair to tell Elizabeth II that she should return immediately to London and attend a formal royal funeral for Diana, who was the mother of a future king. So from French fries to American flies to Tony Blair and his foolish jump to join George Bush in Iraq, Bush's career went with the wind. Finished, done with. And so it was that the Arab world did remember their days of greatness. They believed strongly that they had been dealt an evil turn by the Western world. They believed that we, the United States, was the leader of that Western evil world, and they struck at us. Osama bin Laden, as things went bad to worse, Laura Bush advised her husband she needed to get rid of some of the bad advice he was getting. And so President Bush asked Dick Cheney to ask for the resignation of Donald Rumsfeld. And so Rumsfeld was gone. This made for a difficult time for Bush. Again, not a bad guy, but just not a smart guy. What to do? How to get around these corners. He made some good appointments. The current head of the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice, is a Bush appointment. He has probably made decisions that Bush would now not approve of or agree with. But when you give man or woman lifetime appointment, where you can only rid yourself of them if you can impeach them. And I'll tell you this, you'll never end up impeaching Ginsburg. You couldn't even impeach Scalia. The court was its own animal. And Supreme Court Justice Roberts is one of those strange and different people who knows he's set for life, assuming he doesn't want to retire, and he gives no sign of retiring as he holds together a very, very shaky majority at the court as it begins to look at very important pieces of legislation, like perhaps a review of Roe versus Wade. The times they were changing, as Bob Dylan once wrote. Dylan, who won a Nobel Prize, that still shocks me as much as the Florida recount that gave Bush the White House. Some of these things make for unhappy doings. They were leftovers from the Clinton years. You know, the Clintons inherited problems with Janet Reno, who had a tendency to side with the hardliners in the FBI. But even before that, which I did not mention last time, but should have, the Clintons had another woman who'd gone to Berkeley Law, Bolt, nominated to be on the court, and she couldn't pass muster. Why was that? They were getting to the point where they were nitpicking you to death, and she had had childcare in her home, and she had not paid the Social Security for that childcare, which is a no-no. And when the opposition finds out, your candidate is dead in the water. There's a later success of Mr. Clinton's that I also failed to mention. One of you called me on it. That is that he was very successful in bringing off the Easter peace, the peace that came to live in quiet solitude in Ireland, where the Irish Isle, both the Republic itself and the Republic is governed by Dublin, and the smaller piece, which was part of the United Kingdom, would in fact, using the good offices of Senator George Mitchell, would in fact have a peace treaty. It was hard to believe that people really cared enough to kill each other over whether God was Catholic or was Protestant. But the Irish troubles looked behind us until, of course, Brexit, which now rips again apart much of the agreement, given that the Irish Republic wants very much to stay within the EU. And Britain, apparently under its wobbly, very weak leadership, still thinks it wants to leave the EU. So all these things feed to each other. Did in fact people give Diane Spencer a hard time because she was dating a Arab, a Muslim? He was quite modern man. He was not a religious person, would not have demanded a Islamic ceremony, would not have demanded that Diana become a Muslim. But his family believes that and sees a conspiracy behind the death of Dodi Fayed and Princess Diana. And so you try and put your hands around a Bush administration that deals with all these very strange people, their own cabinet, which is not first rate, a president himself who wasn't very smart, but a nice guy. And you end up in terrible times in ways that did not benefit the American people, for sure. Now, I tell you that next week, instead of being bored by me going on and on and on about politics, you're going to have a wonderful art lecture. And then the following week, in desperation, I will be returning and, in fact, be doing Barack Obama and his 8 wonderful years, in my opinion, in the White House. So I'm going to say goodbye to you. Thank you for listening today. If you do have any questions or any interpretations that you differ with, do give me an email or give me a call. I'm available. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Patrick.
Yes.